Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics.
All right, I'm here this week with Chris Waddell, who's professor emeritus at the Carleton School of Journalism and Communications, and full disclosure, my former thesis advisor. Um, I figured because C18, which is the online news bill, is on the cusp of royal assent as we're recording this, we should have a conversation about the media landscape in Canada right now. CTV had a major bloodletting last week. CBC is under attack, and our major newspaper chain is allegedly on the verge of bankruptcy as it's been stripped by an American hedge fund. So that's leaving our political news landscape in a bit of a quandary. So I figured I'd talk to Chris about where we're heading. Chris.
Hi, Dale. How are you? Not very good, it sounds, from that introduction, or not very encouraging, at least.
No, it's feeling a little bit bleak.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say there's a bunch of things going on all at the same time,
Yeah,
and unfortunately, I think as often it's happened in the internet era, legislation can't keep up with the changes that are taking place in the world in which the legislation is designed to have an impact. So,
yeah,
so what we're seeing is legislation passed by government over the last little while that in a world that really the world keeps changing, and you wonder whether what government is passing is actually relevant to what the current situation is. The
yeah.
most a couple of comments I'd say to sort of kick things off. One of which is the CTV layoffs last week or so. I think really there's a bigger story there. And I think the bigger story there is really the collapse of the private broadcasting business model in Canada. And
Yeah.
that relates to a situation where the private broadcasters have traditionally had local news, national news, but they've made most of their money from importing American programming and buying American programming and run it in the evenings from after the news at supper hour up until the national news at 10 or 11 o'clock, whenever they might do it, or
Yes,
local.
and the favorable simultaneous substitution rules that they got to use to pad their advertising.
Yes, yes. But the problem they're facing now, and it's not a new problem because it's been there, we've seen it coming for several years, it is that the American producers of the programming are are not very enthusiastic about licensing it for playing in Canada. They'd rather be licensing that to the global streaming services because they can make more money if they license it globally, and then Canadians would watch it if it was Netflix or Hulu or Disney or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
So the American programmers, or either some of the people who make the programs, the entertainment and drama and cultural and comedy programs in the U.S., some of those are owned by companies that are starting their own streaming services. And so they would rather have that on their own panel. So that creates two huge problems for CTV and Global. The one problem is, of course, they lose that programming every night, which is very popular still with audiences. They still get good audiences. And even though Facebook and Google have taken some of their advertising, they still get a lot of advertising. So they're losing the advertising revenue from those programs if they can't run those programs anymore. And at the
yeah,
same time, they've got to find programming to fill the space that is taken up by those programs, and that costs money. So what it appears CTV did, to some degree at least, is that CTV is a non-union shop, CTV News. So
hmm,
basically what they did was they cut some of the employees who cost them the most money. They
yeah,
try to save money. And that's some of the senior reporters, that's our bureau chiefs, and of course a year ago Lisa Laflamme as well, who was the anchor of their national newscast. But that doesn't really solve the bigger problem of what are they going to do to replace the model that doesn't exist that isn't going to exist anymore in the next little while.
yeah, yeah. And I on the flip side of that, the public broadcasting side, CBC is facing its own threats, both from the opposition parties, but also I think because it seems to me that they've been trying to do too many things and be too many things to too many people, and that's kind of created their own particular problems.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. A colleague, David Terrace, who died last year at Mount Royal University, and I wrote a book that came out. We were unfortunate enough to have it come out 2 weeks before the pandemic started and everything shut down. It was the University of Toronto Press book called The End of the CBC, and we put a question mark after it. But the big public policy issue there is the government, and it's the government, I would argue, that has to do it, not the CRTC. The government has to decide what role it wants a public broadcaster to play in the new media world and media environment. Because the world we're in now, I mean, CTV has added another element to it, but the world we're in now is very different than the world of 10 or 15 years ago. So where does a public broadcaster fit into that? What should it be doing? What shouldn't it be doing? And we certainly argued in the book, and I would argue very strongly, the first thing they should not be doing is having any advertising on any of their channels. We're in a very I don't know whether you call it bizarre or crazy public policy world at the moment, in which the government of Canada over the last 4 or 5 years has spent about $600 million subsidizing the newspaper industry with labor subsidies. You can now get a tax credit a small tax credit if you subscribe to a digital publication. You can also get they also have tried, not with much success, to set up make it easier for news organizations to become philanthropic and get charitable donation status for tax purposes. At the same time, they're subsidizing labor costs in the news industry. And the labor costs are required in large part because the news industry has lost advertising to Google and Facebook. They're also running a public broadcaster that's has advertising that actually is being taken away from the people that they're subsidizing. So what's the point of that? And we certainly argue in the book that a new rule needs to be put out for CBC, and that the government needs to decide. And the role we would suggest is we get out of advertising. That then changes the whole dynamic of the competitive environment in the news industry, because then competition for audiences, competition for those things is largely about competition for getting people to watch or listen that you can then go and sell to advertisers as being, you can reach this number of people if you advertise with us because our program does this or that. If CBC were out of that, they would no longer need to compete. They're no longer competing, and they could restructure their whole mindset to, in fact, we would argue, become much more of an organization that assists everybody else rather than one that competes with everyone else. And you start with that by making everything that the CBC does under a Creative Commons license. So any news organization across the country can use that material, whether it's a small startup that you may be starting in rural Manitoba, or whether it's the CTV or Global that wants to take some of the foreign corresponding work that CBC reporters do and run it on their programs. Label it, but make it available to everybody for free. But that's part of a bigger model that we lay out, where we say CBC should get out of everything except news and current affairs. So that's it. That's a discussion we can have too.
I guess my questions around that would be whether that leaves them more vulnerable to changes in government, where you have a government that would be hostile to the CBC on ideological grounds, and also whether the making everything Creative Commons leaves them vulnerable to having the avenue for using IP protection when people use their clips for disinformation purposes.
I think those are good questions, but I don't think they're questions for which solutions can't be found. If you're going to use it under Creative Commons, there are certain rules under Creative Commons that you have to use, or a modified version of Creative Commons. I mean, we've got some smart legal people that can write some of those sorts of things. I think that's more of a kind of something of a red herring. I mean, the CBC did try to sue the Conservatives in which election was it now? The 2019 one?
I think it was.
Yeah, it was 2019. It was 2019.
Yeah, right.
And they lost, right? So, but again, if you change the mindset of we're not competing with everybody else, but we're here to try to help the industry survive, that I think changes a lot of things. And we also in the book lay out a series of areas we think the CBC should concentrate its media attention on, and leave the rest available for private broadcasters or private media outlets. So if you define what the role of the CBC is in the system, then you actually, by doing that, you're able to give private media companies an indication of where they would not be competing with the CBC and where they might be competing with the CBC if they wanted to do it.
Okay.
And we laid out, basically we said 5 or 6 areas that we thought were interesting, which were urban life in Canada, public policy at the federal, provincial, and municipal level, health and science, business and the economy, and Canadians who are making a difference. And in some ways, that kind of would match CBC Television's mandate with what CBC Radio already does. And I should say, in talking about all this, and in our book too, we deliberately left Radio Canada out of the whole equation because we don't speak French well enough to. We're not. Well, my French is all right, but I'm not a regular viewer of Radio Canada, and I don't. And their media environment is very different, and they play a very different role as a guardian of French Canadian culture and all those sorts of issues than CBC English does.
Yeah, and I think it's also fair to mention at this point that the notion that you can defund CBC and not Radio Canada wouldn't actually work in practice just because of how integrated they are and how dependent Radio Canada is on CBC resources. So that's often one of the talking points that comes up, particularly from the Conservatives, and I figure we should just throw that out there, just so that it's clear.
Yeah, for instance, the coverage of French language issues, or French language or French Canadians who may be in Saskatchewan, who may be in Alberta, who may be in Manitoba, or maybe in British Columbia. Those Radio Canada news operations rely on using the resources of CBC English, and if you were to shut all that down, it would raise costs quite dramatically for Radio Canada, and it would probably essentially mean that they wouldn't be covering the rest of the country outside of Quebec.
Right. Okay.
And again, we're talking television primarily, but it's true.
I guess this would probably require some kind of a change to the Broadcasting Act. And I just wonder, I guess, what that kind of process might wind up looking like in the current political environment.
Don't know. I mean, we have to see what the political parties have to say. I think a change, if the government were to lay this out, and I mean, may want to choose different things than we suggested. We largely think entertainment and drama they should get out of because they really can't compete with the streaming services because they're spending billions of dollars in programming, and you just can't match that. If government is interested in having Canadian stories told, they would be much better to find a way. We would argue to directly subsidize that programming to get it on the streaming channels, so you're telling them stories to a global audience rather than a Canadian audience. Sports is the same. I mean, there's lots of people who do sports now. CBC doesn't need to be doing sports. In fact, they've now found themselves in this terrible situation of, because they lost the contract in 2014 for NHL hockey, and because it would then, they were then in the same situation that private broadcasters are now. If they lost all that programming, they'd have to they would both lose the advertising, which they've lost because it all goes to Rogers. They would also have to find the programming to replace it, which would be Canadian content, and it would cost them a lot of money to do it. So they just took the Rogers feed and they run the Rogers feed, and they run
commercials for their own shows
yes, but they're also a major promoter of sports gambling these days, which they have no control over. That's a Rogers decision, but it's an unintended consequence of some of the things they've actually done. So getting out of sports, we say, is something that the other people can do it and let the other people do it. So because we at least argue that news and information and current affairs is pretty important to the lifeblood of the country. It's important to people being engaged citizens, and it's being threatened both by the financial problems it faces and also by disinformation and misinformation. And that's where a public broadcaster can play a significant role as well. But yeah, it would require you couldn't do it tomorrow, and it would require a real change in attitude and approach and in thinking about what the role of a public broadcaster is. But maybe that's necessary 30 years after the Broadcasting Act.
I think one of the other criticisms around CBC has been that they've increased their focus on more marginalized communities and underreported groups, and there's been a criticism that they're now producing news that nobody wants to read or watch. But on the flip side, I would say that if they're not covering it, then nobody else is. And I'm just wondering if you had any particular thoughts there.
I think it's a question you have to balance. You have to balance what you're doing. Those are important groups to cover, but they can and should be covered as part of the mainstream news coverage that you do. So, one of the, as you know or may know, there's been lots of debate in the news business, the journalism business, about minority groups or other groups getting not being represented in newsrooms. That's changing slowly. Just as in universities, in university journalism programs over the past 10 or 15 years, there's been a big change in the makeup of the student demographic. It's always been much more female than male, and that's partly, I think, because most journalism programs do their admissions on the basis of high school averages, and women do better than men in high school in most cases. But we've also seen a much more diverse student population, and that's making its way into newsrooms, not quickly enough, some would argue, but it's making its way into newsrooms. But the thing that has to change is the people at the top who've been there a long time, who need to be more willing to think about and listen to the ideas that young people, the more diverse employee group they have now, are coming to them and saying, this is a story, this is what we should do. Now some of that involves different ethnic groups, some of it involves different groups, LGBTQ, etc., all that. Some of it involves different languages, because there's things going on in this country that our mainstream media doesn't report on at all. There is tons of things going on in the Chinese community in this country. There's things going on in the South Asian community. We see that emerge a little bit when there's an incident like the recent murder in Vancouver of Punjabi and of a person who'd been very active in the Sikh community. You can't get those stories if you don't speak those languages, and so we need to have newsrooms have a wider diversity of language skills, which comes with a wider diversity of newsroom population, and then a willingness to accept that the ideas that some of the new people coming into journalism have are ideas worth pursuing and ideas worth doing stories. And that's, so I think, yes, I think you could argue that CBC maybe has tipped the thing too far the other way in a lot of what's happening, but also, but there is a balance in there that was too far the exclusion towards the exclusion side of the pendulum. Are not willing to actually consider ideas that may be out of the mainstream, or ideas that may be different than the way the senior managers of news organizations approach things. Or the standard answer you always get is, "Oh yeah, we did that story 4 years ago." Well, that's 4 years ago, which might as well be 1,000 years now. And a different person from a different background coming into that story, whether it may be Asian, Black, Muslim, LGBTQ, or whatever, may have a different take on it that might be worth listening to. And so newsrooms need to open up on that too. So I think there's a good medium point in there, but maybe the pendulum swings too far each way before it comes back to a medium or some sort of closer to center.
All right. I think for my last question is pretty much, I think there's the threat and backlash from the web giants around C18. And if that happens, do you have any thoughts about what happens next?
Good question. Don't know the answer. I mean, there are some interesting things. There's some interesting elements that are part of it at the moment. If you go back 5 or 6 years, the current Liberal government loved the web giants. If you go back when Madame Joly was the minister, she was down visiting them. She was doing Melanie Joly was down visiting them, doing all that sort of thing, and then things soured. At the same time, news organizations loved the web giants too, because the news organizations thought, to give a little bit of history, the news organizations thought if Google and Facebook featured their stories on their site, that would drive people to the sites of the news organizations. And then the news organizations would profit, being able to make money from the advertising they sell on their site by having all the people come to them to read the stories. And that worked for a little while, but the problem that they ran into is people's habits changed. And so habits changed around reading online news. So you see a story that's featured in Facebook with, a headline and 3 or 4 sentences. You click on the link, so you go to the story on the National Post website, and but you don't stay on the National Post website. You look at that one story, then you go back to Facebook. So the perceived advertising revenue that the news organizations thought they would get by having Facebook and Google drive them to their sites didn't happen, or has disappeared. So all of a sudden, the terminology changed, just as the government's ideas changed, so that now they're stealing our stories. Now they need to pay us for it, and et cetera, and everything that flows out of that. I think that the challenge will, and the difficulty will be, Facebook is saying they'll just take news off their site. We'll see if that happens or not. They're threatening to do it. What was interesting is the Reuters Institute publishes a digital news survey every year of more than 35, 40 countries. It came out about a week and a half ago. And one of the interesting things in it is that there was a significant decline from about 40% to 29% of the people they surveyed in Canada who said they got news from Facebook. So it appears that people are turning away from using Facebook as a news source or relying on it, even before Facebook is sort of saying, well, we're going to pull it, which may, to some degree, make Facebook's case, explain a little bit why Facebook seems to be willing to make that threat, and whether that in fact, in the end, Facebook carries it out, it's not clear. We'll see. But we'll see. You do get a feeling, at least I get a feeling, that that the legislation is written for something that happened before, and it may not be happening now. And as soon as the legislation is passed, there'll be lots of money spent on people figuring out ways to actually achieve what they want to achieve without going around the legislation. So in some respects, and also I think there's legitimate questions to ask about whether the CRTC is the right agency to be involved in all this, whether it has, I don't think there's much public thought that the CRTC has done much to protect the public interests over the last, it's mostly been, there's a theory that goes back to the United States and the progressive era back at the turn of the 20th century, when the railroads were the big problem, and so you created Interstate Commerce Commission in the U.S. to regulate the railroads. The argument, or the thesis that some propose, is that sooner or later regulators get captured by the industry they're regulating, and they realize that their own future relies on the future of the industry as it's structured at that point. So they're not that keen on seeing disruption come in that might threaten both the regulator's own future as well as the future of the people that they're regulating. So I'm not sure the CRTC is the right agency to be doing that. I suspect once C18 passes, we'll start to see some of the reaction. I suspect it's going to be tied up in courts for quite a while. There's also issues that the agreements that the CRTC or whomever is supposed to arbitrate between media companies and Google and Facebook are not going to be made public. So we don't know. Just as, for instance, the labor subsidies we talked about earlier that go to the news organizations, they go to the news organization, and Post Media may put in their annual report they got X number of dollars from the labor subsidy, but it isn't broken down by how many dollars went to the Ottawa Citizen, how many went to the National Post, how many went to the Calgary Herald, and those sorts of things. So it's very difficult to figure out both. Also, that program, there was never any objective anyway, so it's difficult to determine what whether it's meeting its objective or not, because the government never set an objective for what they're supposed to do. So other than just shovel money to newspapers, so that becomes hard from a public policy point of view to determine whether the public got value for its money. So I suspect even once C18 is passed, it's going to be a quagmire for quite a while to come, and I'm not sure that it's going to achieve the objectives. If people think this will all of a sudden start the taps flowing and news organizations will be back in the money, literally as well as figuratively. I think people will probably be disappointed. There needs to be a bigger, because of course, to add one more bit of complexity, all this has been going on. News organizations have been losing audiences too, whether it's print, whether it's broadcast, and some of that is because the things that they're doing may not be of interest to their audience, and some of it may be just because there's a wider range of choice. Some of it is generational, where younger people get information rather than where older people get information. So the problems the news media faces aren't solely the result of Google and Facebook coming up with smarter ways to do advertising than the news industry did. And you even see the Reuters study, which is also interesting on that, says more and more people are just turning away from news and newscasts because they're either finding it more sort of depressing or more coming at you with 1,000 different things all the time, and something is really important today, or news coverage is maybe like everything that's covered today has never happened before, never going to happen again. So it gets kind of, people just walk away from it and sort of say, well, I've got other things to do, which is unfortunate because there are things people need to know and understand and be made aware of to be active and engaged participants in their community.
For sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. And
Sure.
I'm sure we'll talk again in the future.
Sure. That was probably way too long explanations about everything, but it's that if everybody's looking for a transition from what we used to have to what we're going to have, and then it's going to be calm and it's going to be fine again, like a little bit of a storm that passes through, I think they're probably going to be disillusioned, because I think the storm is going to last in different ways. It might be wind one day, it might be lightning and rain one day, it might be cold one day, but it's the challenges won't end quickly or easily. But I still think on the other side that people are still prepared to pay for news and information that helps them in their daily life, and that can be everything from local things to understanding national or international or global events.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
Dale.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.